The propaganda posters back in the States called the B-17 bomber the Flying Fortress. They painted beautiful, gleaming silver planes soaring majestically above the clouds, manned by smiling, clean-cut American heroes. But at 25,000 feet over the flak-filled skies of Europe in the winter of 1944, there was absolutely nothing majestic about it. The air temperature was a bone-shattering 40 degrees below zero. The deafening, mechanical roar of the four massive Wright Cyclone engines vibrated right through your teeth, and the oxygen was so thin that a single disconnected hose meant death by hypoxia in less than 3 minutes. But if the fuselage of the bomber was purgatory, the Sperry ball turret hanging completely exposed beneath the belly of the plane was absolute, unadulterated hell. It was a 4-foot spherical cage of plexiglass and aluminum, suspended in the freezing void. Inside this microscopic glass coffin, folded into an agonizing fetal position with his knees pressed hard against his chest, was Sergeant Tommy Redbow. Redbow was a Navajo Native American, born and raised in the sweeping, wind-carved canyons of the Southwest. He had eyes like a hawk and the stoic, unbreakable patience of a master hunter. But to the rigidly segregated, aristocratic establishment of the 1940s military, he was just an uneducated outsider. They did not trust him to fly the plane, and they did not trust him to navigate. They simply bolted him into a freezing glass bubble on the very bottom of the aircraft, treating him as a disposable human meat shield designed to take the first barrage of enemy fire from below. While Redbow's breath froze into solid white crystals against his oxygen mask, the environment 20 feet above him was a completely different world. Up in the enclosed, relatively spacious cockpit, Captain Duke Harrington was comfortably adjusting the dial on his electrically heated flight suit. Harrington was a wealthy, arrogant Ivy League golden boy who treated the war like a glorified safari. He was flying the bomber not to defeat tyranny, but to secure a chest full of shiny metals that his politician father could use for the next election campaign. To Harrington, the enlisted men bleeding and freezing in the back of the plane were simply the hired help. The heavy static of the intercom crackled in Redbow's freezing leather helmet. "Keep your eyes open down there in the basement, Chief," Captain Harrington drawled over the radio, his voice dripping with condescension. "I did not bring you all the way out of the reservation just to take a nap. If a Messerschmitt puts a hole in my pristine fuselage because you were too busy doing a rain dance, I'll have you court-martialed before we even land." In the freezing glass bubble, hanging thousands of feet above the earth, Tommy Redbow did not press his microphone button to reply. He did not waste his precious, thin oxygen on the arrogant insults of a cowardly elite. Instead, Redbow slowly racked the heavy charging handles of his twin, 50 caliber Browning machine guns. He ignored the burning, freezing agony in his cramped legs. His dark, intense eyes scanned the infinite, blinding white ocean of clouds below them. He knew something that the Ivy League pilot in the warm cockpit did not. The air pressure was shifting. The hair on the back of Redbow's neck was standing up. Captain Harrington thought he was the king of the sky, leading an untouchable armada. But the Navajo hunter hanging in the glass bubble knew the terrifying truth. The flock had just drifted into wolf territory, and the apex predator of the German Luftwaffe was already climbing through the clouds, locking its sights directly onto their right wing. The sky over the Ruhr Valley was a high-contrast canvas of blinding, overexposed white clouds and deep, terrifying shadows. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a stark, gritty photograph shot on heavily grained 35mm film, where the margin between life and death was measured in fractions of a millimeter. The massive American combat box formation droned forward, a unified armada of heavy aluminum and spinning propellers. Then, the sky began to violently tear itself apart. It did not start with the roar of an engine. It started with the terrifying staccato, crack, 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 of heavy German 88mm anti-aircraft flak. The explosions bloomed around the formation like drops of black ink, violently splattering across a physical film negative. Down in the freezing, claustrophobic sphere of the belly turret, Sergeant Tommy Redbow felt the shockwaves physically punching the thin plexiglass millimeters from his face. He gripped the heavy wooden spade grips of his twin, 50 calibers, his knuckles turning white beneath his heated gloves, tracking the deadly sky. Suddenly, A deafening, metallic thunderclap completely overpowered the roar of the wind. A high-explosive flak shell detonated directly beneath the B-17's right wing. The massive, 30-ton flying fortress violently shuddered, throwing the crew against the aluminum bulkheads. Redbow looked up through the top of his glass cage and watched in horror as the No. 3 Wright Cyclone engine violently seized. A thick, volumetric pillar of oily black smoke and searing orange flame instantly erupted from the cowling, trailing behind the bomber like a funeral shroud. Up in the pristine, heated cockpit, Captain Duke Harrington completely lost his nerve. Instead of fighting the heavy, vibrating flight yoke to keep his crippled bomber tucked safely inside the overlapping fields of fire of the massive formation, his Ivy League arrogance gave way to sheer, unadulterated panic. Harrington aggressively chopped the throttles, desperately trying to extinguish the fire, killing the bomber's airspeed. It was a fatal, amateur mistake. The burning B-17 instantly dropped out of the protective combat box, sinking rapidly into the freezing, empty sky below. In bomber warfare, the formation is life. A straggler is already a ghost. As the roar of the armada faded into the distance, a terrifying, heavy silence fell over the crippled bomber. The sky was completely empty for exactly 3 seconds. Then, diving straight out of the blinding, halation-ringed glare of the midday sun, came the apex predator. It was a Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter, but it was not painted in the standard Luftwaffe camouflage. It was painted completely matte black, absorbing the harsh sunlight like a flying shadow. This was the Black Falcon, an elite, ruthless German ace who had built his terrifying reputation exclusively by hunting down and slaughtering crippled American stragglers. The Falcon did not attack wildly. He approached with the cold, mathematical precision of an executioner. He knew the B-17's blind spots perfectly. He swooped in low and fast, his nose perfectly aligned with the bomber's tail. Bert! The blinding muzzle flashes of the Messerschmitt's 20mm nose cannons lit up the freezing air. The high-explosive, armor-piercing rounds systematically tore through the B-17's tail gunner position, completely shattering the rear glass and silencing the American tail gunner before he could even squeeze his triggers. The elite German ace then pulled his stick back, raking his heavy cannons directly up the spine of the bomber. The razor-sharp rounds punched through the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage like paper, severing hydraulic lines, snapping electrical cables, and filling the narrow, freezing crew compartment with blinding sparks, suffocating smoke, and the screams of wounded men. The flying fortress was officially bleeding to death, and the Black Falcon was circling back around to deliver the final, killing blow. The 20mm cannon shells of the Black Falcon did not just pierce the aluminum skin of the flying fortress. They violently severed the main electrical and hydraulic arteries of the bomber. The interior of the massive aircraft instantly became a high-contrast, strobing nightmare of electrical fires and bursting oxygen lines, looking like a stark, overexposed war photograph brought to terrifying life. Down in the freezing, -40-degree void beneath the plane, the hydraulic whine of Sergeant Tommy Redbow's Sperry ball turret abruptly died. The heavy twin, 50 caliber machine guns locked firmly in place, pointing straight down at the distant, geometric grid of the German countryside. Redbow immediately knew what that meant. To get out of the spherical turret, the gunner had to rotate the guns straight down so the small glass hatch aligned perfectly with the heavy steel door inside the fuselage. Redbow violently wrenched the manual hand crank to line up the doors, but the gears would not budge. A molten piece of 20mm shrapnel had fused the tracking ring completely solid. Redbow was mathematically, physically entombed inside a 4-foot plexiglass bubble on the bottom of a dying 30-ton machine. Up in the cockpit, bathed in the harsh, flashing strobe of the red emergency lights, the aristocratic facade of Captain Duke Harrington completely shattered. The No. 3 engine was a roaring blowtorch of aviation fuel, and the heavy flight yoke was shuddering violently in his hands as the right wing began to dangerously dip. To save the plane, Harrington needed to cut the fuel mixture, feather the prop, and step heavily on the left rudder to counteract the drag. It required the iron will and steady hands of a true commander. But Harrington was not a commander. He was a politician playing dress-up. Through the shattered, frost-rimmed windshield, the horizon tilted violently. Harrington looked at the terrifying, spinning drop below him. He did not look back at the radio operator, who was bleeding heavily onto the aluminum deck grates. He did not think about the Navajo gunner, trapped in the unheated glass cage beneath his boots. His Ivy League arrogance gave way entirely to raw, unfiltered, cowardly self-preservation. Harrington let go of the flight yoke. "She's going down!" Harrington shrieked, his voice cracking over the intercom, entirely devoid of military bearing. "Abandon ship! Every man for himself!" Before his shocked, bleeding co-pilot could even unbuckle his harness to grab the flight controls, Harrington reached under his heated leather seat and clipped on his pristine silk parachute. He violently slammed his fist into the emergency bailout bell. Ring, ring, ring. The terrifying, deafening sound of the evacuation alarm echoed through the burning fuselage. Harrington ripped the emergency release handle on the nose hatch. The roaring, freezing slipstream instantly howled into the cockpit. Without a single word, the golden boy from the elite establishment dove headfirst through the trapdoor, allowing the minus 40-degree wind to violently suck him out into the blinding white sky. He had deployed his silk canopy and saved his own skin, leaving his bleeding crew and the trapped Native American gunner entirely alone in a falling bomb. As the captain abandoned the cockpit, the Flying Fortress lost its final ounce of stability. The massive bomber violently stalled, its nose dropping sharply toward the earth, entering a terrifying, screaming death dive. Down in the glass coffin, the G-forces slammed Tommy Redbow hard against the frozen plexiglass. He looked down through the glass between his boots as the earth began rushing up to meet him at 300 miles an hour. The elite had left him to die. But the Navajo hunter was not ready to become a ghost. The B-17 Flying Fortress was no longer an aircraft. It was a 30-ton aerodynamic brick screaming toward the German countryside at 300 miles per hour. As the nose dipped violently into a fatal, spiraling dive, the catastrophic G-forces slammed Sergeant Tommy Redbow hard against the frozen plexiglass of the ball turret. The blood rushed violently to his head, and the deafening, ungodly howl of the minus 40-degree wind ripping through the torn fuselage above sounded like the roaring of a slaughtered animal. Captain Harrington had taken the coward's way out, bailing out and leaving the crew to burn. The Sperry turret's rotation gears were completely fused by molten shrapnel. Redbow was bolted inside a glass coffin, staring straight down at the rapidly expanding, snow-covered checkerboard of the Ruhr Valley. But where the Ivy League aristocrat had broken under the pressure, the Navajo hunter found his absolute, terrifying focus. Panic in a canyon means death. Panic in a freezing glass bubble means the same. Redbow did not scream for help over the dead intercom. He fought against the crushing G-forces, painfully contorting his cramped body in the tiny sphere, and reached down to the heavy leather sheath strapped to his right calf. He drew a heavy, bone-handled hunting knife, a piece of tempered steel forged back on the reservation, carried through every combat drop. He could not shatter the thick, reinforced plexiglass, and he could not manually crank the fused gears. But Redbow understood the anatomy of the machine. He jammed the thick steel blade of the hunting knife directly into the microscopic gap between the jammed locking latch and the heavy steel door frame leading up into the fuselage. Gritting his teeth against the freezing agony in his hands, Redbow used the knife as a brutal lever. He did not just pull. He put the entire kinetic force of his shoulders and back into the blade, fighting the spinning gravity of the dying bomber. Snap! The molten shrapnel holding the latch finally sheared under the immense, brute force leverage. The heavy steel door violently gave way, swinging inward. Redbow did not hesitate. He grabbed the edges of the frozen hatch and violently hauled himself up out of the glass coffin, rolling onto the catwalk of the freezing, chaotic belly of the B-17. The interior of the bomber was a high-contrast nightmare of strobing electrical fires and blinding white wind howling through the gaping flak holes. It was a mechanical slaughterhouse. Aluminum shrapnel was embedded in the bulkheads, and the air was thick with the smell of vaporized hydraulic fluid and copper. A few feet away, the young radio operator from Brooklyn was slumped against his destroyed console, bleeding heavily from a deep shrapnel wound in his leg, his eyes wide with shock as the plane plummeted. Redbow crawled across the steeply angled deck grates. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He violently ripped a massive strip of silk from a ruined reserve parachute, wrapped it high around the kid's thigh, and twisted it into a brutal, agonizing tourniquet, using a broken radio antenna as a windlass. "Hold this." Redbow roared over the screaming wind, forcing the kid's trembling hands onto the makeshift tourniquet. "Do not let go!" Redbow pulled himself up by the bomb bay racks and fought his way up the steeply inclined deck toward the nose of the plane. The G-forces were tearing at his flight suit, trying to throw him toward the tail, but he moved, with the relentless predatory grace of a man accustomed to navigating treacherous vertical cliffs. He burst through the bulkhead door into the cockpit. It was empty, freezing, and howling with wind from the open escape hatch. The co-pilot was slumped, completely unconscious, over his yoke, struck by a piece of the 20mm cannon shell that had shattered the right windshield. The captain's seat was completely vacant, the parachute harness tossed carelessly on the floor. Redbow looked at the altimeter, spinning wildly out of control. 12,000 feet, 9,000 feet, 6,000 feet. The Earth was rushing up to annihilate them in less than 60 seconds. The Navajo gunner, a man the military deemed too uneducated to ever touch the controls of a multi-million-dollar aircraft, wiped the freezing blood from his eyes and stepped over the captain's discarded gear. He dropped his heavy boots onto the rudder pedals and grabbed the blood-stained flight yoke of the 30-ton beast. The cockpit of the plunging flying fortress was a chaotic, strobing nightmare of shattered glass and screaming wind. If this were a movie, the camera would push in close for a high-contrast, low-angle shot, capturing the sheer terror of the spinning altimeter against the heavy film grain of the 1940s reality. The Earth was no longer an abstract map. It was a photorealistic, violently rushing landscape of snow-dusted pine trees and dark granite rushing up to annihilate them. 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet. Sergeant Tommy Redbow dropped his heavy, grease-stained boots onto the aluminum rudder pedals and wrapped his bleeding hands around the captain's flight yoke. He had never read a pilot's manual. He did not understand the complex mathematics of aerodynamics or the intricate hydraulic systems of the massive 30-ton machine. But Tommy Redbow understood the wind. He had grown up hunting along the jagged, vertical drops of the Navajo canyons, where the air currents were wild, living things that could snap a man off a ledge or carry a hawk for miles. He did not look at the shattered instrument dials. He looked through the violently shuddering, frost-rimmed windshield. He felt the sickening, heavy drag of the dead No. 3 engine pulling the right wing down into the fatal spin. The B-17 was mathematically dead, plummeting at 300 miles an hour, the airframe screaming as it approached terminal velocity. Redbow did not panic, and he did not violently jerk the yoke back. That would snap the aluminum wings completely off the fuselage. Instead, in a moment of pure, instinctual genius, illuminated by the volumetric shafts of light piercing the smoke-filled cockpit, he slammed his left boot down hard on the rudder pedal to counteract the dead engine's drag. Then, he braced his shoulders against the back of the pilot's seat and began a smooth, agonizingly steady pull on the heavy flight yoke. The physical resistance was immense. It felt like trying to pull a sinking battleship out of the ocean with bare hands. The hydraulic lines whined in sheer mechanical agony. Redbow's muscles burned, the veins in his neck bulging as he fought the unyielding gravity of the death dive. 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet, 500 feet. The jagged, snow-covered tops of the German pine trees filled the entire windshield, rushing toward the glass like a wall of green spears. With a deafening metallic groan that resonated through every single rivet of the massive airframe, the nose of the flying fortress finally began to lift. The violent wind rushing through the shattered cockpit changed pitch, dropping from a terrifying shriek to a deep, resonant roar. At exactly 200 feet above the forest floor, the 30-ton bomber leveled out. The belly of the aircraft shaved the tops off the highest pine trees in a blinding explosion of snow, violently shaking the entire fuselage. But it was flying. Redbow held the yoke steady, panting heavily, the freezing wind whipping his dark hair. The elite captain had abandoned the ship, assuming it was a lost cause. But the outcast had just wrestled the falling fortress right out of the jaws of death. Up above the clouds, the Black Falcon, the ruthless German ace, pushed his matte black Messerschmitt Bf-109 into a steep, sweeping dive. He was coming down to take his gun camera footage of the American bomber's fiery crash, expecting to see a crater of twisted, burning aluminum in the snow. Instead, as the German fighter punched through the lower cloud deck, the elite pilot froze. Framed perfectly in the center of his crosshairs, silhouetted against the stark, snow-covered valley, the crippled B-17 was not a burning wreck. It was flying low and level, hugging the terrain like a massive, wounded bird of prey refusing to die. The hunter had just become the hunted. The sky above the German tree line was a chaotic blur of green pine needles and blinding white snow, rushing past the shattered cockpit of the flying fortress at over 200 miles an hour. Sergeant Tommy Redbow had saved the dying bomber from the grave, but the sky was far from empty. 2,000 feet above them, the matte black Messerschmitt Bf-109 ripped through the cloud deck. The Black Falcon had expected to film a burning crater. Instead, he saw a 30-ton aluminum Leviathan violently skimming the treetops, refusing to die. To the elite German ace, this was a personal insult. A crippled bomber without a fighter escort was not supposed to survive his initial attack. With a cold, methodical precision, the German pilot pushed his throttle to the firewall, throwing his nimble fighter into a screaming vertical dive. He was not going to attack from the rear again. The tail gunner was dead, but the B-17 was flying too low to safely dive behind. Instead, the Black Falcon swung his fighter in a massive, sweeping arc, dropping down to the exact altitude of the bomber. He was setting up for a head-on pass, the most terrifying, psychologically brutal maneuver in aerial combat. Two aircraft flying directly at each other, closing the distance at a combined speed of over 600 miles an hour. Through the frost-rimmed, blood-stained windshield of the B-17, Tommy Redbow saw the black dot on the horizon rapidly expanding. In the textbooks written by the Ivy League tacticians like Captain Harrington, a pilot facing a head-on attack in a crippled heavy bomber is supposed to dive, violently break formation, or attempt to throw off the enemy's aim. But Tommy Redbow was not a pilot who learned to fly from a book in a warm classroom. He was a hunter from the canyons, and you never, ever turn your back on a charging predator. Bert! Bert! At 1,000 yards, the nose of the Messerschmitt erupted in blinding flashes of yellow fire. The 20mm cannons sent a lethal stream of high-explosive tracer rounds streaking across the frozen sky, looking like a terrifying, high-contrast laser beam cutting through the 35mm film grain of reality. The rounds violently slammed into the B-17's nose cone, entirely shattering the remaining plexiglass and ripping through the aluminum bulkheads with deafening, metallic shrieks. Shrapnel violently whipped through the freezing cockpit, tearing the leather padding from the co-pilot's empty chair just inches from Redbow's head. The German ace expected the American pilot to violently flinch. He expected the massive bomber to dip its wings or try to dive into the trees in a desperate, cowardly bid for survival. But Tommy Redbow did not blink. His dark eyes locked onto the approaching fighter with an unyielding, terrifying intensity. Instead of turning away, Redbow reached forward with his bleeding right hand and violently shoved the 3 surviving engine throttles all the way to the absolute maximum. The massive Wright Cyclone engines roared in mechanical agony. Then, gripping the heavy flight yoke with both hands, Redbow did not dive. He pulled back, steering the massive 30-ton flying fortress directly into the exact center of the Messerschmitt's flight path. He was not flying an airplane anymore. He was swinging a massive aluminum club. Inside the cramped cockpit of the German fighter, the elite ace's eyes went wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. The American bomber was not dodging. It was expanding in his windshield at a horrifying rate, transforming from a target into a colossal wall of spinning propellers and armored steel. The aristocratic German realized in a split second that the man behind the American yoke was not trying to survive. He was fully prepared to die to take the hunter with him. The game of aerial chicken was over. The elite ace broke first. At the absolute last, microscopic fraction of a second, entirely abandoning his firing run, the Black Falcon violently yanked his flight stick to the left, desperately trying to roll his fighter out of the massive bomber's path. It was too late. The Messerschmitt snapped into a frantic roll, but the B-17 was simply too massive. With a deafening, sickening crunch of tearing metal, the right wing of the German fighter violently clipped the heavy, armored leading edge of the B-17's left wing. The kinetic transfer was absolute. The 30-ton flying fortress violently shuddered, but its massive mass absorbed the blow. The 3-ton Messerschmitt, however, was instantly obliterated. The impact violently snapped the fighter's wing clean off the fuselage. The matte black aircraft immediately lost all aerodynamic stability, instantly cartwheeling into a violent, uncontrolled spin. Redbow watched through the shattered side window as the apex predator of the Luftwaffe violently slammed into the German pine forest below, erupting into a massive, blinding fireball of aviation fuel and shattered steel. The hunter was dead. The outcast had just won a head-on duel using a broken bomber as a battering ram. The English Channel was a cold, slate-gray void stretching endlessly beneath the shattered windshield of the B-17. The deafening roar of the wind had become a constant, numbing reality inside the freezing cockpit. The massive flying fortress was bleeding hydraulic fluid, and the two surviving Wright Cyclone engines were violently sputtering, starved of oil, and running purely on the mechanical prayers of the man at the yoke. Through the haze of exhaustion and freezing blood, Sergeant Tommy Redbow finally saw them. The jagged, pale outlines of the white cliffs of Dover emerging through the coastal fog. He had flown the 30-ton Leviathan across the ocean using nothing but instinct, the stars, and the heavy, agonizing pull of the manual cables. But the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. A bomber is designed to fly. It is not designed to crash gracefully. As the B-17 limped into the airspace over the American bomber bases in East Anglia, the radio operator, pale and shivering with a makeshift silk tourniquet tied tightly around his thigh, dragged himself to the cockpit door. He fired 2 red emergency flares through the open top hatch. The brilliant crimson phosphorus cut through the thick English fog, signaling to the ground crews that a dead ship was coming in. Down below, the air raid sirens wailed. Crashed trucks, ambulances, and jeeps tore across the wet tarmac of the airfield, their yellow headlights cutting through the gloom. Redbow reached down with his right hand and grabbed the heavy landing gear lever. He pulled it back with all his remaining strength. Nothing happened. There was no mechanical whine, no heavy thud of the massive rubber tires locking into place. The 20mm cannon shells of the Black Falcon had completely severed the hydraulic lines. The massive bomber had no legs. They were going to have to bring 30 tons of heavily armed aluminum down directly onto the unforgiving concrete of the runway. "Brace!" Redbow roared over the howling wind, his voice echoing through the ruined fuselage. He did not tell the men to pray. He told them to hold on. Redbow lined the nose of the B-17 up with the long gray strip of the runway. His eyes were locked on the rapidly approaching Earth. He waited until the absolute last agonizing second, when the concrete was a mere 50 feet below the shattered nose cone. With a swift, brutal motion, Redbow violently cut the fuel mixture to the surviving engines and slammed the magneto switches to off. The massive propellers slowed, shuddered, and died. If the engines were running when the belly hit the runway, the propellers would shatter, tearing through the fuselage and instantly turning the bomber into a massive fireball of aviation fuel. The flying fortress dropped like a stone in total silence. Screech! The impact was absolutely earth-shattering. The moment the thin aluminum belly of the bomber struck the concrete, a deafening metallic scream ripped through the airbase. The massive B-17 did not bounce. It ground into the runway like a colossal sled. A blinding, high-contrast rooster tail of brilliant white sparks erupted from beneath the fuselage, illuminating the thick English fog like a fireworks display in a nightmare. The friction violently tore the lower gun turret, the very glass coffin Redbow had escaped from, completely off its mountings, sending it sparking and tumbling down the tarmac. Redbow fought the heavy yoke, standing on the dead rudder pedals, using every ounce of his brutal, instinctual strength to keep the sliding, burning 30-ton brick perfectly centered on the concrete. If a wing dipped and caught the dirt, the bomber would violently cartwheel and disintegrate. For 2,000 agonizing feet, the fortress screamed across the runway, engulfed in a massive cloud of volumetric white smoke and dust. And then, with a final heavy groan of warping steel, the bomber violently ground to a halt. The sudden silence was heavier than the explosion. The only sounds were the hiss of hot metal on wet concrete and the distant wail of the approaching crash trucks. The emergency crews practically threw their vehicles into park, sprinting toward the smoking, ruined fuselage with fire extinguishers and medical kits. They fully expected to pull charred corpses out of the wreckage. Instead, the top escape hatch above the radio room groaned open. One by one, the surviving enlisted crewmen, the radio operator, the waist gunners, the bleeding co-pilot, pulled themselves out onto the scorched, smoking aluminum spine of the bomber. They were battered, covered in soot and blood, but their lungs were drawing the cold, damp English air. An army medic rushed to the wing, looking frantically at the men. "Where's the captain?" Who brought this ship down? The young radio operator from Brooklyn, leaning heavily on the shoulder of a waist gunner, did not answer the medic right away. He turned his head and looked toward the shattered windows of the cockpit. Out of the smoke and the jagged, torn metal of the nose hatch stepped Sergeant Tommy Redbow. The Navajo gunner's flight suit was soaked in hydraulic fluid and grease. He looked out over the sprawling, chaotic airfield with the absolute, terrifying calm of a man who had just wrestled a tornado into submission and won. The enlisted men of the bomber crew did not salute him. They just stared at him with absolute, unadulterated reverence. The system had locked him in the basement to die, but the hunter had broken the cage and carried them all home on his back. But as the sirens faded, a sleek, pristine military staff car pulled up to the edge of the runway, cutting through the smoke. If you framed this shot on heavy, high-contrast 35mm film, the visual divide would be jarring. On one side of the smoking, ruined B-17 stood the surviving enlisted crew, battered, bleeding, and covered in a thick layer of black engine grease and hydraulic fluid. In the center stood Sergeant Tommy Redbow, the Navajo gunner who had just wrestled 30 tons of dying aluminum across the English Channel. On the other side of the tarmac, cutting through the thick coastal fog, a pristine, olive-drab military staff car screeched to a halt. The door swung open, and out stepped Captain Duke Harrington. His leather bomber jacket was completely spotless. His hair was perfectly combed. He had been picked up by a British patrol boat after bailing out safely over the channel, and he had already spent the entire car ride to the base spinning a heroic narrative for the brass. The plane was fatally crippled. I ordered my men to jump. I stayed at the controls until the bitter end before miraculously escaping. Harrington strode toward the wreckage, trailed by a military photographer and 2 heavily armed military police officers. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the massive tail section of his destroyed bomber sitting on the runway. And then he saw the men. Harrington's aristocratic face flushed a violent, humiliating crimson. His perfect, cowardly lie was standing right in front of him, breathing the damp English air. If the press or division command found out he had bailed out while his enlisted men and an uneducated minority gunner saved the multi-million-dollar aircraft, he would not just lose his medals, he would face a firing squad for desertion. He had to control the narrative instantly. "Military police!" Harrington shrieked, his voice cracking with sheer desperate panic, pointing a trembling finger directly at Redbow. "Arrest that man immediately! I am charging Sergeant Redbow with gross insubordination, mutiny, and the unauthorized operation of a heavy aircraft. Secure him in the brig!" The 2 MPs unholstered their sidearms, their boots crunching on the shattered glass of the runway as they moved toward the Navajo hunter. Tommy Redbow did not flinch. He did not raise his hands, and he did not back away. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes locked onto the cowardly captain with the terrifying, unblinking intensity of an apex predator. But Redbow did not have to fight this battle alone. Clack, clack! The heavy metallic sound of a .45 caliber Colt M1911 pistol being racked echoed like a thunderclap across the silent tarmac. The young radio operator from Brooklyn, his leg still bound in Redbow's bloody silk tourniquet, had drawn his sidearm. He did not point it at the ground. He leveled the heavy iron sights directly at the chest of Captain Harrington. Clack, 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 clack. Beside him, the 2 surviving waist gunners and the bleeding co-pilot drew their own sidearms. They formed a solid, impenetrable wall of dirty leather and cold steel around the black gunner. The rigid, systemic racism of the 1940s military command was instantly vaporized by the undeniable reality of survival. The elite establishment had locked Redbow in a freezing glass coffin to die, and the elite captain had abandoned them to the fire. The men of the Flying Fortress had made their choice. "Put the guns away, boys," the military photographer stammered, slowly lowering his camera. "You take one more step toward the chief," the radio operator growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried over the hiss of the cooling engines. "And I swear to God, Captain, the official report will say you died in the crash." The heavy fog rolled over the runway, amplifying the suffocating silence. Harrington looked down the barrels of 4 heavy caliber pistols held by men who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He looked at the murderous, unforgiving eyes of the white soldiers who had chosen a Navajo mechanic over their Ivy League commander. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that his rank and his political connections meant absolutely nothing against men who had just survived hell. Trembling, Harrington slowly took a step backward. He nodded frantically to the MPs. Without a single word, the military police holstered their weapons and backed away. Harrington turned and practically sprinted back to his staff car, leaving his dignity, his narrative, and his unearned glory burning on the concrete. You will never read about the mutiny of the East Anglia tarmac in the official military archives. The Army Air Corps sanitized the incident. Captain Harrington was quietly transferred to a desk job in London, far away from any cockpit. Sergeant Tommy Redbow was never given the Distinguished Flying Cross he earned. They could not acknowledge his genius without acknowledging their own cowardice. But out there in the freezing, blood-soaked skies of Europe, the men of the bomber squadrons knew the truth. They knew that the greatest pilot of the war never wore an officer's pin, and he never asked for a medal. He just broke out of his cage, grabbed the yoke, and became an absolute legend in the clouds.